Somewhere in Switzerland, 12 to 14 examples of a boutique off-roader left a small workshop in the early 1980s. That is not the rarest vehicle on this list. Neither is the Russian amphibious machine, a small manufacturer, has built only 20 of, or the American convertible 4x4, whose production records were simply never kept. Every vehicle here was built in numbers, a modern limited edition would envy. Several rejected outright by the military customers they were designed for. One of them raced the Paris-Dakar rally and rolled. Stick around for that one. This is the 10 rarest 4x4s you have probably never heard of, counting down to the nearly mythical. Let's start with the least rare of the 10, and work our way down. Number 10. Volkswagen Golf Mk2 Country. In 1990, Volkswagen handed a small Austrian company the strangest brief in the Golf's history. Take the everyday hatchback, keep the running gear largely stock, and turn it into something that could survive a farm track. Steyr Daimler Puch, the same firm that built military Pinzgauers and assembled Mercedes G-Wagons under contract, took the Golf Mk2 Synchro and lifted it. The result rode roughly 6 inches higher than a standard Golf, wore a tubular underbody guard, bolted across the entire floor pan to protect the fuel tank and exhaust from rocks, and added a spare tire mount welded to the rear hatch because there was no longer room for one anywhere else. The drivetrain stayed close to the existing Synchro all-wheel drive system, a permanently engaged setup using a Ferguson viscous coupling to shuffle power between axles without the driver doing anything. What changed was everything around it. Reinforced suspension mounts, a raised air intake positioned high on the front wing so the engine would not drown in deep water, and a full underbody skid plate that most road-going hatchbacks of the era simply did not need. Volkswagen built 7,735 of them between 1990 and 1991, sold almost exclusively in Germany, Austria, and a handful of neighboring markets. It was never officially exported to North America. The country name would later resurface on other VW models, but none of them carried the awkward, overbuilt charm of a hatchback wearing a bull bar and a raised air intake, built by the same company that made actual military vehicles. The Golf Country's real legacy is quieter than its production number suggests. It proved a mainstream hatchback platform could be turned into something legitimately capable off pavement without a total redesign, years before crossover SUVs made that idea a marketing category. Steyr Puch closed the book on the project after 2 model years, and Volkswagen never repeated the exact formula on the Golf again. Today, surviving Golf Country examples are concentrated almost entirely in Central Europe, where salt roads and decades of daily use have taken their toll on the small production run. A clean, unmodified example rarely surfaces outside German and Austrian classifieds, and even there, buyers report waiting years between listings. For a car engineered by the same firm that built genuine military hardware, the Golf Country never had to prove itself against a Range Rover or a proper truck-based off-roader. It simply had to survive a winter in the Alps better than the hatchback it was based on, and by every account, it did exactly that. Would you daily drive a lifted 1990s hatchback over a modern crossover? Or is that a terrible idea? Number 9. Isuzu VehiCROSS. Isuzu's design team in the mid-1990s was told to build a concept car. Somewhere along the way, nobody told them to make it practical, and the VehiCROSS went into production almost unchanged from the show floor. The body panels were injection-molded polyurethane bolted directly over the steel structure rather than painted metal, a choice borrowed from off-road racing trucks, where impact resistance mattered more than a smooth factory finish. The exposed body seams and asymmetric taillight were not styling accidents. They were functional leftovers from a design that was never softened for a mainstream production line. Underneath the unmistakable shape sat a genuinely serious drivetrain. The VehiCROSS used Isuzu's torque-on-demand system, a full-time 4-wheel drive setup with an electronically controlled center differential that could shift power front to rear in real time based on wheel slip, years before that kind of electronic torque management became common on mainstream SUVs. A 3.5-liter V6 sent power through a 4-speed automatic, and the whole vehicle sat on a shortened, reinforced version of the Trooper's ladder frame, stiffened specifically to handle the torsional stress of serious off-road use. Isuzu built the VehiCROSS for the Japanese domestic market starting in 1997, then brought a modified version to the United States for the 1999 and 2000 model years. Combined production across both markets landed at roughly 5,958 units, a vanishingly small number for a vehicle that most car buyers in its era would have recognized on sight from magazine covers alone. It was not a slow seller because nobody wanted it. It was a slow seller because Isuzu built almost none of it, and priced it well above, where a niche two-door SUV could reasonably move volume. By the time production ended, Isuzu was already retreating from the American passenger vehicle market entirely, and the VehiCROSS quietly became one of the last genuinely weird vehicles the company ever sold there. It has since become a minor cult object among off-road enthusiasts who value the torque-on-demand system's genuine capability over the polarizing body panels wrapped around it. The bigger irony is that Isuzu's own Trooper, built on a related platform and sold in vastly higher numbers, never got anywhere near the same cult following. The VehiCROSS earned its scarcity value largely by looking like nothing else Isuzu, or anyone else, was willing to put into production at the time. Isuzu basically built a concept car and sold it. Should more manufacturers try that? Number 8. Toyota Trekker. Before the 4Runner existed as a nameplate, Toyota needed to test whether American buyers wanted a covered, passenger-friendly version of the Hilux pickup. Rather than engineer a factory solution from scratch, Toyota partnered with Winnebago, a company better known for motorhomes than off-road conversions, to build a fiberglass camper shell-style rear section that bolted onto the Hilux pickup bed. The result was sold through Toyota dealers as the Trekker, built on the same reinforced frame and part-time four-wheel drive system as the contemporary Hilux 4x4 pickup, but with a fully enclosed rear cabin, rear bench seating, and carpeted interior panels that turned a work truck into something closer to a passenger vehicle. Under the fiberglass shell sat genuine truck hardware. The Trekker used the Hilux's solid front and rear axles, a 2-speed transfer case, and the same 22 R4-cylinder engine that powered contemporary Toyota pickups, giving it real low-range crawling capability that a modern crossover SUV simply does not have. The conversion work itself was handled largely outside the main Toyota assembly process, which is part of why exact yearly breakdowns are difficult to pin down with certainty. Toyota sold the Trekker in the United States from 1981 to 1983, with most estimates placing total production between 1,200 and 1,500 units across that run, though because the shell conversion happened through a third-party partnership rather than a single factory line, precise year-by-year figures were never centrally published the way mainstream Toyota production numbers were. What is clear is that the Trekker directly previewed the formula Toyota would formalize with the first-generation 4Runner in 1984, which used a similar removable fiberglass top over a pickup platform, this time built in-house rather than through an external partner. Because the Trekker's production run was so brief and its distribution limited mostly to dealers already selling Hilux pickups, surviving examples are scarce enough that many off-road enthusiasts have never encountered one in person, despite it being the direct mechanical ancestor of one of Toyota's most successful SUV nameplates. What makes the Trekker easy to overlook today is that it never carried its own dedicated marketing push. It was a dealer-level conversion riding on the back of an existing pickup's reputation, and once the factory-built 4Runner arrived in 1984, with Toyota's own name fully behind it, there was no reason for anyone to keep talking about the fiberglass-shelled truck that got there first. Did anyone here know the 4Runner had a rare fiberglass shell prototype cousin before it? Number 7. Citroen Mehari. Citroen built the original Mehari as a lightweight plastic-bodied utility vehicle in 1968, and it sold well enough that the French military eventually asked for a proper 4x4 version to evaluate. Citroen obliged in 1979, engineering a genuine 4x4 variant built on the heavier floor pan and suspension components from the Citroen Ami Super, rather than the standard Mehari's simpler underpinnings. Unlike its stablemate on this list, the Mehari 4x4 did not use two separate engines to drive each axle. It used a single 602 cubic centimeter flat twin engine, the same unit found in the 2CV, paired with a conventional 4-speed gearbox and a 3-speed transfer gearbox capable of handling grades up to 60%. To help protect the small air-cooled engine from being overworked in low range, Citroen fitted the 4x4 version with a standard tachometer that the two-wheel drive Mehari never received. The 4x4 also got inboard rear disc brakes and fully independent suspension on all 4 corners, making it one of the more mechanically sophisticated small off-roaders of its era, at least on paper. The French army, the customer this entire program was built around, ultimately passed on placing a significant order. Left without its intended buyer, the Mehari 4x4 was sold only to private customers, at roughly double the price of a standard two-wheel drive Mehari, a steep ask for what was still, underneath the added hardware, a lightweight plastic-bodied utility vehicle with a 29 horsepower engine. Citroen built the Mehari 4x4 from 1979 until production quietly stopped in 1983, with total output landing at 1,213 units, a rounding error next to the more than 140,000 standard. Mehari, built across the model's full production run. The body panels are visually near identical to a standard Mehari at a glance, distinguished mainly by steel bull bars front and rear, and a spare wheel relocated onto a specially shaped section of the hood, which makes the 4x4 version easy to overlook entirely unless you know precisely what you are looking for. Mechanically, the 4x4's fully independent suspension on all 4 corners put it ahead of several considerably more expensive off-roaders of its era, most of which still relied on solid axles and leaf springs. Underneath a body that weighed barely more than 500 kilograms, that was a genuinely sophisticated setup, wasted on a vehicle whose intended customer never showed up to buy it. The military passed on it, and it still got built anyway. Would you have bought one at double the price? Number 6. Citroen 2 CV Sahara. If the Mehari 4x4 solved 4-wheel drive with a single engine and a transfer case, to compromise at all. Rather than engineer a driveshaft to send power to the front axle, Citroen's engineers simply installed a second complete flat twin engine in the rear of the car, connected to its own fuel tank, its own gearbox, and its own throttle linkage, mechanically synchronized to the front engine, so both units could be driven together, or, in an emergency, independently if one failed entirely. The result was 2 425 cubic centimeter engines, totaling roughly 24 horsepower combined, mounted at opposite ends of a car that otherwise looked like an ordinary 2CV, wearing a raised roofline and a spare tire bolted to the hood. Each engine drove only the axle nearest to it, meaning the Sahara achieved genuine 4-wheel drive with zero shared mechanical linkage between front and rear power delivery, an approach no other production car before or since has replicated at scale. 2 separate fuel tanks meant 2 separate fuel gauges on the dashboard, and 2 ignition switches meant a driver could, in principle, start and drive the car on a single engine if the other refused to cooperate in the field. Citroen built the 2CV Sahara from 1960 through 1971, and total production landed at just 694 units, sold primarily to oil exploration companies, mountain rescue services, and a handful of adventurous private buyers who wanted genuine off-road capability wrapped in one of the most mechanically simple cars ever mass-produced. Weighing barely more than a standard 2CV, despite carrying an entire second engine, the Sahara could still manage steep, loose terrain that considerably more powerful contemporary off-roaders struggled with, largely because so little weight sat on any single axle at any given time. Survivor estimates for the 2CV Sahara sit at roughly 27 examples worldwide today, a number small enough that most Citroen specialists will go entire careers without personally inspecting one. Original examples now regularly change hands for multiples of what a standard vintage 2CV commands, driven almost entirely by the sheer engineering novelty sitting under 2 separate hoods. It is worth pausing on how strange that novelty actually is. Citroen engineers had a perfectly conventional option available, a driveshaft running the length of the car, and chose instead to build and calibrate two separate engines to run in mechanical sympathy with each other. No other production 4x4 in this countdown, or arguably in automotive history at any real scale, solved the same problem by simply doubling the engine count instead. 2 engines, 2 fuel gauges, 2 ignition switches. Genius or completely unnecessary? Number 5. Monteverdi Safari. Peter Monteverdi built his reputation in Switzerland making hand-finished grand touring coupes, powered by American V8 engines, competing on paper with Ferrari and Maserati, despite operating out of a small workshop near Basel. By the mid-1970s, the fuel crisis had gutted demand for that kind of car, and Monteverdi needed a new direction. He found it by looking at what International Harvester was already building in America: the Scout, a rugged but unglamorous 4x4 utility vehicle with a steel ladder frame, live axles, and a 2-speed transfer case. Monteverdi bought Scout chassis and running gear directly from International Harvester, then shipped them to Carrozzeria Fisore in Italy. The Safari that emerged bore no visual resemblance to a Scout at all. Quad rectangular headlights, a squared-off Italian-designed silhouette, and an interior trimmed in leather with options including a refrigerator, a television set, and air conditioning that the Range Rover of the same era, its intended rival, could not match. Underneath the coach-built bodywork, the Safari kept the Scout's fundamental off-road hardware essentially unchanged. A box-section ladder frame, solid front and rear axles on leaf springs, and switchable part-time 4-wheel drive with a 2-speed transfer case and manually locking front hubs. Engine choices range from a standard 5.2-liter Chrysler Phi 8 up to an optional 7.2-liter unit capable of pushing the 2-ton SUV past 200 km per hour on the road, a figure the contemporary Range Rover's 3.5-liter V8 could not touch. Monteverdi built the Safari from 1977 until 1982, when International Harvester ended Scout production entirely and cut off Monteverdi's supply of donor chassis. Annual sales are understood to have run in the tens rather than the hundreds, with total lifetime production estimated in the low hundreds of units. A cheaper companion model, the Sahara, used the Scout's original bodywork with only minor styling changes and sold in even smaller numbers, understood to be around 30 examples total. Monteverdi did not stay out of the luxury off-roader business for long after Scout production ended. The company went on to build 4-door conversions of the 2-door Range Rover, years before Land Rover offered a factory 4-door of its own, proving the Safari had been less a one-off experiment than a genuine, if short-lived, specialty within Monteverdi's small operation. A Ferrari-adjacent Swiss brand built a luxury Scout with a fridge and a TV. Wildest 70s SUV feature you've heard of. Number 4. Audi Quattro Trezza Hunter. Walter Trezza had a legitimate engineering resume before he ever built a car under his own name. He had worked directly on developing Audi's original Quattro all-wheel drive system, the technology that would go on to dominate rally racing through the 1980s. When he left Audi to start his own small coach-building operation, he took that engineering credibility with him and set about building road cars that combined Audi's drivetrain with body modifications no factory model offered. The Hunter was Trezza's take on a raised road-going, all-terrain Audi, built on the platform of the Audi 90 Quattro, rather than a dedicated off-road chassis. Trezza's team lifted the suspension, fitted larger all-terrain tires, and reworked the bodywork with flared wheel arches and additional protective cladding, while leaving the underlying Quattro all-wheel drive system essentially untouched, since that system was already genuinely capable and needed no re-engineering to work off pavement. Because the Hunter was built by a small independent coach builder, rather than Audi itself, no precise production figure specific to the model has ever been formally documented, and no source has been found that puts a reliable total on Trezza's combined output either. What is documented is that the Hunter existed in 2 distinct generations, an earlier version built on the Audi 90 Quattro's original chassis in the mid-1980s, and a later version built on the newer chassis after 1986. That second version was not actually built by Walter Trezza's own company. Trezza had personally filed for bankruptcy by then, and production continued instead under a separate firm officially run by his wife, using the Trezza name and design language, but operating independently of the man himself. Treza's company did not survive long as an independent operation, and detailed records of exactly how many hunters left the workshop were never centralized the way a factory production line would document its output. What survives today exists mostly through word of mouth among Audi Quattro specialists and a handful of documented individual cars, making the Hunter one of the more genuinely obscure entries built on a chassis that, in its unmodified form, is one of the most celebrated all-wheel drive platforms in automotive history. There is a particular irony in how thoroughly the Hunter has been forgotten. The man who built it helped engineer the drivetrain that made Audi a rallying legend, and yet his own follow-up project, arguably a more usable, everyday version of that same technology, survives today only as scattered word of mouth. An Audi engineer built his own raised Quattro off-roader on the side. Would you trust a coach-built Audi over a factory one? Number 3. A MC Eagle Sundancer. American Motors Corporation built the Eagle in 1980 as, by most reasonable definitions, the first crossover vehicle sold in the United States. A passenger car body raised on a lifted suspension, paired with a genuine full-time four-wheel drive system called Quadra-Track, co-developed with Chrysler's new process gear division. It was aimed squarely at buyers who wanted winter capability without buying a truck. A year later, AMC decided that Formula needed a convertible version, and the results were stranger than anyone expected. AMC contracted the Griffith Company, a small Florida coach builder previously known for converting Toyota Celica's into Targa-topped convertibles, to perform the same operation on the Eagle. Griffith reinforced the Eagle's unibody structure, welded a steel Targa roll bar to the door pillars for passenger protection, and fitted a removable fiberglass front roof section paired with a fold-down rear canvas top, all while keeping the Eagle's four-wheel drive hardware completely intact underneath. AMC would build the cars in standard hardtop form, then ship them to Florida for the Griffith conversion before returning the finished convertibles to Wisconsin for dealer delivery, an unusually long supply chain for what was ultimately a niche dealer option. No factory production ledger for the Sundancer's 4x4. Eagle variant specifically has ever surfaced, and no owner's club or historian has been able to produce one since. Estimates from individual documented cars and period reporting range from as few as 40 examples up to a combined total, including two-wheel drive Concorde conversions, of just under 200 across both models and both production years. The gap between those figures is not a rounding error. It reflects a genuine absence of factory-level record-keeping for a coach-built option that AMC itself treated as a minor dealer add-on, rather than a distinct production model worth formally tracking. Griffith had reportedly hoped the Sundancer's modest early interest would justify opening a dedicated conversion shop near AMC's Kenosha, Wisconsin factory. Sales never reached the volume needed to justify it, and the entire project quietly ended after the 1982 model year, leaving behind a vehicle whose exact scarcity may simply never be fully known. That absence of a hard number has, if anything, made the Sundancer more interesting to the small community of AMC collectors who track individual surviving cars by serial number rather than by any published factory total, since for this particular vehicle, the serial numbers on surviving cars are effectively the only production record that exists at all. A convertible 4x4 with no official production number. Does that make it more or less collectible to you? Number 2. Aton Impulse Viking 2992. Aton Impulse builds vehicles in Naberezhny Chelny, a Russian industrial city better known for heavy truck manufacturing than boutique off-roaders. The Viking 2992 is their answer to a question most manufacturers never seriously ask. What does a 7-seat amphibious vehicle look like when weight, water crossing capability, and low ground pressure matter more than speed or refinement? The Viking rides on massive balloon tires, whose pressure the driver can adjust in real time from inside the cabin, lowering pressure to spread the vehicle's weight over a wider contact patch when crossing soft mud or snow. A pneumatically adjustable suspension system can raise ground clearance by roughly 25 centimeters at the push of a button, and the fully sealed body allows the Viking to float and propel itself through water at low speed, once it reaches a river or lake crossing too deep to drive through directly. Underneath the utilitarian, faintly monstrous bodywork sits a surprisingly modest engine, a 1.77-litre, four-cylinder unit producing around 82 horsepower, the same VAZ-2130 engine found in the Lada Niva, one of the most mass-produced off-roaders in Russian automotive history. On a vehicle weighing over 3 tons, that engine is not built for speed. Aton Impulse rates the Viking's top road speed at roughly 60 km per hour, dropping to around 15 km per hour once it is in the water, figures that make clear this is a vehicle designed for emergency rescue and remote industrial access, rather than any kind of recreational driving. According to Aton Impulse's own leadership, the company had built 20 examples of the Viking 2992 as of the mid-2000s, with stated ambitions to scale toward hundreds of units annually within 5 years. That scaled production never materialized at anything close to the projected volume, leaving the Viking as one of the smallest volume, purpose-built, amphibious 4x4s in active production anywhere in the world, priced at roughly $200,000 in its standard configuration. The Viking has also passed certification for unrestricted on-road use in some markets, an unusual distinction for an amphibious vehicle of its size and purpose. In practice, that means a machine engineered to drive out or onto a frozen river or cross open water can, at least on paper, also be driven to the shops, even if almost no owner has ever needed to test that particular use case. It floats, drives on land, and runs on a Lada engine. Would you want one, or is that a hard pass? Number 1. Sparrow Windhound. Franco Sparrow built his reputation in Switzerland producing outrageous, low-volume boutique vehicles, most built one at a time by hand in a small workshop. The very first Windhound was ordered by a customer in Neuchâtel in 1978, built with the 3-door body, Fiat Campagnola suspension, and a 6-cylinder BMW engine. From there, Sparrow turned the approach into a genuinely capable, off-road luxury vehicle, assembled using running gear sourced from whichever donor vehicle a given commission called for, most commonly the Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, a Jeep Cherokee Chief, or the Range Rover. Each Windhound was closer to a bespoke commission than a production vehicle. Sparrow's small team built the bodywork from scratch around the donor chassis and drivetrain, wrapping genuine 4-wheel drive hardware in an angular, hand-built body that shared no panels with whatever vehicle had supplied its mechanical foundation. Interiors were finished to customer specification, and because no two builds were guaranteed mechanically identical, there was never a single standardized Windhound to document. That very first Windhound was sold on and entered into the 1980 Paris-Dakar Rally, with driver Michel Diallo behind the wheel. It covered roughly 3,500 kilometers before a series of rollovers forced it to retire. Sparrow bought the wrecked car back, found it had been looted while abandoned, and rebuilt it himself, adding the roof-mounted exhaust and air intake pipes that became one of the model's signature details. That the Windhound could serve luxury clients and rally endurance from the same rough platform speaks to how seriously Sparrow's team engineered the underlying chassis work. Total Windhound production across its build run is estimated at about a dozen examples, built individually rather than in any batch, making it not just the rarest vehicle on this list, but one of the rarest 4x4s built by any manufacturer, boutique or otherwise, in the modern era. Locating a documented example today typically means going through Sparrow's own archive, or a small handful of European collectors tracking the build history, car by car. Franco Sparrow would go on to build hundreds of one-off concept vehicles across his career, many stranger than the Windhound. But this one holds a specific distinction. It was built to actually work, to cross a desert at speed in a real rally, on running gear that started life underneath a Mercedes, a Range Rover, or a Jeep, and ended up underneath something that looked like nothing else on the starting grid. About a dozen units, one of which raced Paris-Dakar before rolling out of the race. Is this the rarest 4x4 you've ever heard of? 10 vehicles, a combined production run smaller than a single busy year at most car factories, and in more than one case, nobody left behind an exact number to argue about. That is the strange thing about true rarity. It does not announce itself. It just quietly disappears from the record, one unsold coach-built example at a time, until decades later a handful of survivors, if any of these 10 are sitting in your neighborhood, in a barn, or on a dealer lot somewhere, that would be worth knowing about.